When the Sega Mega Drive launched in Japan in 1988, it was marketed as the arcade experience brought home. The images found in magazines of the time seemed to confirm just that, showing off graphics that looked like they were pulled straight from your local coin-op. As more games were released, the hardware just kept looking better and better. At the time, the sprites were huge in comparison to most 8-bit software, and the extensive use of parallax scrolling was a sight to behold. Everything was colorful and detailed, leading to countless conversations that Sega finally had a real shot at a worldwide contender. At that point, nobody, or at least nobody in my sphere of contact and influence, ever questioned the graphics and sound capabilities of the Genesis. As Western markets grew and more games were released, the Genesis was often praised as the most powerful consumer-level hardware platform available. Games like Revenge of Shinobi, Strider, Ghouls 'N Ghosts, ESWAT, and Shadow Dancer were absolutely stunning, closing out Sega's first 2 years with the Genesis in fine style. Even when the Super Nintendo showed up in 1991, I heard no one question the technical chops of the Genesis. The first Sonic title showed up and most publications praised it as a bona fide hardware showpiece. The gaming public seemed to agree because it sparked a sales revolution that propelled the Sega Genesis into the #1 spot for the next few years in multiple Western territories. But some big changes in the way games were being made, starting in 1992 onward, led to many Sega Genesis games looking and sounding notably inferior to the other platforms available. What happened? Why are early Sega Genesis games praised so heavily, while later games are often seen in a far less positive light? In this episode, we will take a run down memory lane and look at the Genesis and how things changed for it over its lifespan. With 1992 came some major changes to the games released on the Mega Drive and Genesis. Up until that point, most of the software released for the platform had been developed in Japan by either Sega's internal teams or Japanese third parties. But after the release of the first Sonic and the resulting boom in sales, Sega needed more software and it needed it pronto. They employed a multi-pronged strategy to deal with this. First, they put together the Sega Technical Institute, which was to be a collaboration between American and Japanese developers to bring out some grade A software that could be built into major franchises for years to come. Sega also began reaching out to Western software companies for its projects. Many of Sega's biggest releases between 1992 and 1995 were developed by these companies: California Games, Tasmania, Green Dog, Kid Chameleon, TALESPIN, Batman Returns, CHAKAN, ECCO, X-Men, Jurassic Park, Toe Jam and Earl, Eternal Champions, VECTORMAN, and countless sports titles were developed outside of Japan by companies that often did not have the same pedigree of Sega's in-house teams. Even Japanese third parties began to go this route, using Western developers to release games they had once made themselves. Sunsoft had started off like a champ, developing the incredible Batman the video game and Super Fantasy Zone, before outsourcing projects like Blaster Master 2 and Batman Revenge of the Joker to disastrous results. Other Japanese developers began to do this again and again. Data East developed the Super Nintendo version of Joe and Mac in-house, but when it came to the Genesis release, it was offloaded to Eaton Entertainment Software, who was responsible for the abysmal RoboCop 3. A huge influx of Western publishers also meant the wide distribution of other companies' IP. Strider was picked up by US Gold and Tiertex for a brand new sequel that was a shadow of its former glory. The simple fact was, the massive increase in developers and publishers from outside of Japan had a huge impact on the amount of quality software available. I'm not saying it was all bad, but when you compare the likes of Shinobi 3 or Streets of Rage 2 to any of this stuff, it's easy to see where the best games were coming from. Many of these companies like Acme Interactive had very little to no experience at all making video games before Sega contracted them to do so. Acme Interactive, also known as Malibu Interactive, had made but one single Genesis title before Sega handed over their boxing and basketball franchises to them, as well as a few outside licenses like Batman Returns and X-Mutants. And when NovoTrade went to develop the new IPs Ecco the Dolphin and Cyborg Justice for Sega, the only game under their belt was the previously mentioned California Games port. Sometimes the development of a game was negatively affected by the instability of these small studios. In 1991, CHAKAN the Forever Man was being made by Recreational Brainware, who folded and went out of business before the game was completed. This forced Sega to help fund members of the team to finish the project as extended play, which itself was dissolved after CHAKAN was finished. Imagine for a moment putting so many high-profile licenses and new IPs in the hands of teams that had almost no experience with your hardware or were so financially strapped that they had issues finishing the development of them. The truth is, most of these developers that Sega used had primarily worked in the computer gaming sectors, an area that differed quite a bit from home console software. This stood in stark contrast to the way Nintendo developed and published its games. Nintendo rarely released more than half a dozen games a year, created most of them in-house, and allowed them the time they needed to be done right. When Nintendo did allow outside studios to make games for them, they were involved in shaping the project into something that stood out. Nintendo had the Japanese third-party support to do this without compromise. Whereas Sega needed to release dozens of games each year under its banner, Nintendo itself could release far less and still have plenty of games for its platform. In fact, even with Sega publishing far more games than Nintendo during the 16-bit era, the Super Nintendo still has nearly 1,000 more retail games than the Genesis worldwide. Sega had thrown together a cadre of game developers to manage their mini releases, yet few of them had any Genesis hardware experience at all. You want an explanation why so many Sega games were of dubious quality? This right here was a huge part of it. One problem Sega really suffered from during its time with the Master System was a serious lack of popular third-party titles. While companies like Capcom were making huge hits on the NES, they didn't touch Sega's 8-bit offering, leaving Sega to do all the heavy lifting in regards to the software library. Much of the situation moved over to the Sega Genesis in its initial years. I'll spare you the whole story about unfair business practices and exclusive contracts by Nintendo, but the end result was very much worth mentioning. Konami didn't make an in-house Sega product until 1992, 4 years after the release of the Mega Drive. Capcom didn't have one until 1993, 5 years after the fact. Data East was 3 years late, Takara 5, and Tecmo 4. That means that while most of these companies were on their second and even third generation engines for the Super Nintendo, they were putting out their very first software releases for Sega's Genesis. That's no small thing considering the huge differences between the two platforms' technologies. The Genesis sound was synth-based, a stark change from the samples used by Nintendo. The Genesis color palette was a mere 512 options, with just 64 available to be displayed at any one time. Again, quite a difference from its competitor. These companies were also gun-shy about pouring any real money into Sega development because the Mega Drive had performed so poorly in Japan. Konami famously released Sunset Riders on a 4-megabit cartridge on the Genesis, half the size of the Super Nintendo release and missing much of its content. Capcom even tried to offload the development of Street Fighter II to an outside studio before quality control issues forced them to do it themselves. Even then, Capcom's inexperience with the Genesis resulted in sound samples that were scratchy and unimpressive. Tecmo, prolific maker of the Ninja Gaiden franchise, seemed only interested in taking advantage of the sports market on the Genesis. While the Super Nintendo got all 3 Ninja Adventures and an exclusive RPG, Sega just got some ports of Tecmo Super Bowl and a few other sports titles. Make no mistake, these developers still put out some good software, but it's 100% clear what their priorities were. and it sure won't Sega. In the early days of the Genesis, everything had been good old-fashioned hand-drawn sprites and backgrounds. This came across spectacularly well, wowing us with dozens of games that looked very similar to our favorite arcade offerings. The 61 on-screen colors really weren't an issue for those first 2 years, and I legitimately do not recall a single conversation with friends or articles in any publication bringing the subject up. Fast forward a handful of years and we see an explosion of digitized and pre-rendered assets. Entire games would be built upon these techniques, including the immensely popular Mortal Kombat. Some developers and publishers doubled down and started digitizing everything. Batman Forever did it for both the sprites and the backgrounds. Sports games began to do it as well. Of course, in the right circumstances, this could look quite impressive, but on the Genesis, those high color assets were often butchered in the downgrade. This was true of digitized pre-rendered material as well. Whereas Genesis color could be stretched to some great results with hand-drawn material, this often was just not the case with games using new techniques from 1994 forward. Even when Sega published something themselves, the colors were often dark and dreary, standing in stark contrast to popular alternatives on other platforms. There's just no question about it. What had started out as no issue at all had become a massive hurdle by 1994. Many arcade conversions benefited from more color, and the Genesis just did not have a lot to spare. When the Genesis launched initially, the vast majority of its software were done by Japanese developers. These talented folks had experience across all facets of game development, including writing music for FM-based chips and platforms with multiple CPUs. This meant that much of the early music you heard on the Genesis sounded quite good. The experience these developers brought to the table cannot be dismissed and was a huge part of the appeal for the platform in those early days. But by 1991, Sega had so many inexperienced Western developers making software for it, they had a real issue with most of them needing help writing music for the Genesis. This led to Sega of America to hire Recreational Brainware, the very same company that folded while making CHAKAN the Forever Man, to create the GEM sound driver. GEM stood for Genesis Editor for Music and Sound Effects. It would go on to be used in a quarter of the games released for the platform, or what amounted to over 200 software releases. GEMS was essentially a library of sounds meant to mimic instruments and other real-world noises, so developers could compose music and effects easier than building a driver from scratch. Like most software drivers, GEMS was not at fault for the quality of the compositions created on it. There are a number of Genesis titles that use GEMS that actually sound quite good. But to understand why GEMS gets the hate it receives, you need to only consider why it was created in the first place: inexperience. Sega understood that many of its Western contracts needed help because they simply were not well versed in the hardware of the Genesis. GEMS was not magically gonna erase this issue. It was only gonna make things a bit less troublesome for developers to actually get something out within budget and time constraints. As you'd expect, GEMS did not automatically mean a soundtrack or sound effects were going to be good or bad, because like most art, it ultimately came down to the skill of the composers themselves. Some created quite decent music with GEMS, while many crashed and burned with some of the most ear-piercing trash of the 16-bit era. Sadly, no amount of help could change the fact that creating sound and music with the Genesis was incredibly difficult and took a lot of skill. Many of these inexperienced composers would have shat the bed with or without GEMS to blame. This often stood in direct contrast to Sega's competition at Nintendo. The Super Nintendo sound hardware was based around samples of real instruments, with functions for hardware-based compression, allowing even the most inexperienced developer results that were quite often a lot more tolerable than the worst of the Genesis. I wanted to do this episode to really stress how much things were different for Sega during the 16-bit generation. history often presents that somehow Sega and Nintendo were on equal terms as competitors, but this simply could not be further from the truth. Sega never, at any point, had the same level of third-party support as Nintendo. Even when the likes of Capcom and Konami came over to the Genesis, Sega often received projects that were fewer in number and not nearly as complete as their Nintendo counterparts. Sega of Japan also turned away from 16-bit development far sooner than Nintendo. With Saturn releasing in 1994, Sega's biggest studios had been focused on 32-bit software almost exclusively. That left Sega of America and its inexperienced contracts to do all the heavy lifting for the Genesis. No small task considering the level of quality Nintendo and its third parties were still putting out. The big story of the Genesis and Super Nintendo software seems to have been positioned on this fallacy of equality or equal footing, and it's simply not true. The Mega Drive was also released 2 years before the Super Famicom, leading to a number of technical advantages for Nintendo. This immediately put the machines at odds in terms of how and when their expected lifespans would end. Sega was ready to jump ship to a new generation far sooner than Nintendo because its hardware was years older. This gives the illusion that Sega's 1994 and 1995 Genesis lineup is piss poor compared to Nintendo's, while the simple fact of the comparison is that Sega of Japan had moved on to developing Saturn games by that point. To end this video, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying Sega of America's games could not be a fun time, but they published so many games for the Genesis, quality definitely took a backseat to quantity. But this was also the reality of being Sega. At no time did Sega have the same level of third-party support as that of Nintendo, leaving them responsible for the ravenous appetites of gamers that seemed to have no end. It's easy to break down the great console war on the simplest of terms, Sega versus Nintendo, but the truth was these two companies couldn't have been more different, both in function and circumstance. Sega was early to the party and had to fight tooth and nail for every game on its platform. Nintendo came later, with newer technology, towing its third parties like an unstoppable locomotive on the tracks to absolute success. Nintendo had the luxury of focusing only on a few releases every year, while Sega published dozens more. The fact that Sega was able to stand up to that for any length of time is nothing short of a miracle, and a true testament to just how good some of their games actually were. Sega burned the candle at both ends, the middle, and everywhere else in between. That fire was never gonna last long, but it sure was pretty while it lasted. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.